Let go of my mom. The hallway exploded with Lily's voice as an ICE officer yanked harder, dragging Mrs. Carter forward. Her shoes scraped the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She's coming with us, the officer growled. That's when Grace, Lily's twin, stepped in. She planted herself directly in front of them, arms stretched wide, eyes locked. You are not taking her anywhere. One officer laughed. Move, kid. Grace didn't move. Behind her, Lily wrapped both arms around their mother's waist, pulling her back with everything she had. Two 13-year-old girls, standing between their mother and three armed men. The afternoon light slanted through the narrow windows of their apartment building, casting long shadows across the peeling linoleum. Mrs. Carter's hands trembled, not from fear of what these men might do to her, but from what they might do to her daughters if this went wrong. Girls, please, she whispered. Just let them. No. Grace's voice cut through the air like a blade. The officer in front, badge 4782, took a step closer. His breath smelled like stale coffee and entitlement. This is your last warning. Step aside or we'll move you ourselves. Lily tightened her grip on her mother. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice came out steady. Show us your warrant. The hallway went still. Badge 4782 blinked. What? Your warrant? Grace repeated, slower this time. You're attempting to detain a United States citizen. You need a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Show it to us. The second officer, younger, with a fresh haircut and nervous eyes, glanced at his partner. The third stood by the stairwell, blocking the only other exit. We don't need to show you anything, badge 4782 said. Yes, Lily said quietly. You do. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, stay with this one, because what happens next changes everything. Badge 4782's jaw tightened. He reached for Mrs. Carter's arm again, but Grace shifted her weight, still blocking him. Her sneakers squeaked against the floor. You didn't identify yourselves when you entered the building, Grace said. You didn't state your agency or your purpose. You didn't present credentials. And you're attempting an arrest without probable cause. The young officer's hand drifted toward his radio. Badge 4782 raised a hand to stop him. Who the hell taught you that? He sneered. Our father, both girls said at once. Mrs. Carter closed her eyes. Jonathan. God. She could almost hear him now, standing in their old kitchen, quizzing the girls over breakfast. What do you do if someone tries to violate your rights? You stand firm. You speak clearly. You don't back down. He'd made it a game when they were younger. Role-playing scenarios, teaching them the Constitution like other fathers taught baseball stats. She thought it was paranoia back then. Now she understood it was preparation. Your father's not here, badge 4782 said. And you're interfering with federal officers. Prove it, Grace shot back. Call your supervisor. Right now. If this is a legitimate operation, they'll confirm it. If it's not, she let the sentence hang. The young officer shifted his weight. The third one by the stairwell pulled out his phone, pretending to check it, but his eyes kept darting to the twins. Something was wrong. They all knew it. Badge 4782's face flushed red. You think you're smart? You think because you memorized some civics class nonsense you can... Fourth Amendment, Lily interrupted. Unreasonable search and seizure. 14th Amendment. Equal protection under the law. And if you're targeting my mother because of how she looks, that's racial profiling, which violates federal civil rights statutes. The young officer actually took a step back. Mrs. Carter had been born in Atlanta. She'd lived in this country her entire life, worked as a nurse for 18 years, paid her taxes, voted in every election. The only crime she'd committed was being a black woman coming home from a double shift at the hospital. That's all it took. We have reason to believe, badge 4782 started. Based on what? Grace demanded. What specific, articulable facts gave you reasonable suspicion that my mother violated immigration law? Silence. The kind that screams the truth louder than words ever could. Badge 4782's hand moved to his belt. Not to his gun, but to his handcuffs. Last chance. Move. That's when Lily pulled out her phone. What are you doing? The young officer asked, voice pitching higher. Calling your supervisor. Put that away. No. She scrolled through her contacts with shaking fingers. Found the number. Hit dial. The three officers exchanged glances. Badge 4782 lunged forward, reaching for the phone, but Grace caught his wrist. A 13-year-old girl, barely 5 feet tall, holding back a grown man. Don't touch her. The phone rang once, twice. Hang up. Badge 4782 hissed. 3 times. I said hang up. 4 times. Click. This is Deputy Director Michael Reynolds. Lily hit speaker. Her voice came out clear, controlled. Nothing like the terrified child she felt like inside. My name is Lily Carter. I'm 13 years old, and I'm calling from 847 Morrison Street, apartment 3B. 3 men identifying themselves as ICE agents are attempting to detain my mother, Sharon Carter, a U.S. citizen, without a warrant, without stated probable cause, and based on what appears to be racial profiling. The hallway had gone dead silent. We have security camera footage from the building, Lily continued. We have witnesses, and these officers have failed to present any legal documentation justifying their presence or their actions. A pause on the other end. Papers rustling. What are the badge numbers? Deputy Director Reynolds asked. Grace read them off. All 3. Slowly. Clearly. More rustling. Then, put the senior officer on the line. Badge 4782's face had gone from red to gray. Lily held out the phone. He didn't take it. Now, Reynolds said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass through the speaker. Badge 4782 grabbed the phone like it was a live grenade. Walked 3 steps away. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper, but in the enclosed hallway, every word carried. Sir, we were following a lead. Whatever Reynolds said next made Badge 4782's shoulders slump. No, sir, we don't have. Another pause. It wasn't like that, we had reason to. Badge 4782 stopped talking. Just listened. His free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all its edge. Yes, sir. Understood, sir. He walked back, handed Lily the phone without meeting her eyes. Miss Carter. Reynolds was still on the line. Yes, sir. I need you to do something for me. Can you and your sister keep your mother inside your apartment until additional officers arrive? How do we know they'll be legitimate? Grace asked, still standing between her mother and Badge 4782. A low chuckle. Smart girl. I'm texting you photos and badge credentials right now of the supervisory team I'm dispatching. They'll arrive within 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. And Miss Carter. Yes. You did exactly the right thing. The line went dead. Lily looked at the 3 officers. They looked at each other. You need to leave, Grace said quietly. We're not going anywhere until... The young officer started. Yes, you are, Mrs. Carter said. It was the first time she'd spoken since this started. Her voice was soft but absolute. The voice she used when the twins were little and had pushed too far. My daughters just schooled you in constitutional law. A deputy director just tore you apart over the phone. And you've been standing in my hallway, harassing my family, without cause, without authorization, and without decency. She stepped forward, and this time Lily and Grace moved with her, flanking her on both sides. So here's what's going to happen, Mrs. Carter continued. You're going to walk out of this building. You're going to wait for your supervisors. And you're going to pray that when they review the security footage, they find some shred of justification for what you tried to do here today. Badge 4782 opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. This isn't over. You're right, Grace said. It's not. The 3 officers turned and walked toward the stairs. Their footsteps echoed in the silence. The one by the stairwell looked back once, something unreadable in his eyes, then followed the others down. Only when the street door slammed shut did Mrs. Carter's legs give out. Lily and Grace caught her, one on each side, and half-carried her into the apartment. They locked the door, all 3 locks. Then Grace grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle the way their father had shown them years ago during a tornado warning. Mrs. Carter sat on the couch and started to cry. Not from relief, from rage. "I was born here," she whispered. "I've lived here my whole life. I've saved lives. Her voice broke. "They saw my skin and decided that was enough." Lily sat on one side, Grace on the other. "Dad used to say something," Grace murmured. "Remember?" Mrs. Carter nodded, wiping her eyes. "Rights only matter if you know them," Lily finished. "And if you're brave enough to use them. Stay with this story, because justice is coming, but the road there is harder than anyone should have to walk." The supervisory team arrived exactly 19 minutes later. Lily checked their credentials against the photos Deputy Director Reynolds had sent. Every detail matched. She still made them wait while Grace called Reynolds back to confirm. Only then did they open the door. Captain Maria Santos introduced herself with a firm handshake and apologetic eyes. She was flanked by 2 senior agents and a woman in civilian clothes who identified herself as a civil rights investigator. "Mrs. Carter, I can't begin to apologize for what happened here today," Santos said. "But I can promise you that we will investigate this thoroughly." "I want those men fired," Mrs. Carter said flatly. "That's not my call to make. But I can tell you that what they did, attempting a detention without assignment, without a warrant, without legal basis, that's not just against policy. It's potentially criminal." The investigator was already reviewing the building's security footage on a laptop. Lily watched her face tighten as the video played. "They entered the building without identifying themselves," the investigator said quietly. "Followed Mrs. Carter up the stairs. Cornered her in the hallway. She looked up. Did they ever state why they were detaining you?" "No," Mrs. Carter said. "The first words I heard were, 'You're coming with us.'" The investigator's fingers flew across the keyboard, taking notes. "And your daughters intervened?" "Our daughters," Mrs. Carter said, her voice filling with fierce pride, "knew their rights better than federal agents." Santos asked them to walk through everything that happened. Grace and Lily took turns, their accounts matching perfectly, each detail sharp and clear. They'd learned that from their father too. If you're going to tell the truth, tell it precisely. The investigator recorded everything. When they got to the part about calling Deputy Director Reynolds, Santos actually smiled. "That," she said, "was brilliant." "It was necessary," Grace corrected. Over the next week, the investigation unfolded like a flower opening to poison at its center. Badge 4782 was Officer Dennis Holloway, 17 years with ICE, with 3 prior complaints of excessive force and 2 allegations of racial profiling. Nothing had stuck before. The young officer was Matthew Chin, 2 years on the job, still on probation. The third was Officer Robert Morrison, 10 years in, transferred from another district after an incident his file called inappropriate conduct during a detention. None of them had been assigned to that area that day. There was no active case. No tip, no warrant, no duseresastion. Holloway's partner from a previous assignment testified that he'd heard Holloway say, "These neighborhoods need to learn we're watching." Chun admitted under questioning that Holloway had told him they were doing a sweep. Morrison claimed he thought it was an official operation. The security footage told the real story. 3 officers, 1 black woman. A decision made in seconds based on nothing but skin and suspicion. The case went to court on a cold Tuesday in November. Mrs. Carter wore her nurse's uniform. She'd just come from a shift, and she refused to change. Let them see who they'd targeted. Lily and Grace wore matching navy dresses their grandmother had bought them for their father's funeral. They'd grown since then. The hems hit above their knees now. But they wanted to wear something that connected them to him. The courtroom was older than the girls, with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice. Judge Robert Whitman presided, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. The prosecution presented their case with surgical precision. Security footage, phone records, witness testimony from neighbors who'd seen the whole thing. The legal standard was clear. The officers had violated departmental policy, civil rights statutes, and basic human decency. Then came the twins. Lily went first. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Moss, smiled gently at her. Lily, can you tell us what happened when the officers first approached your mother? Lily's voice didn't shake. They grabbed her. They didn't identify themselves. They didn't explain why they were detaining her. They just said she was coming with them. Were you afraid? Yes. What did you do with that fear? Lily looked at her mother, at Grace, at the empty space in the gallery where their father should have been sitting. I used it, she said. My dad taught us that fear is just information. Tells you something matters. It doesn't tell you to run. Across the courtroom, several jurors leaned forward. What did you say to the officers? Moss asked. I asked to see their warrant. Did they show you one? No. Did they explain why they didn't have one? They said they didn't need to show me anything. Moss paused, letting that sink in. What did you do then? I called their supervisor. Why? Because they were violating my mother's constitutional rights, and someone needed to stop them. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Paul Garrett, tried during cross-examination to paint Lily as coached, rehearsed, acting beyond her years. Isn't it true your father was a senator? Garrett asked. Yes. And he taught you about the law? Yes. So you were prepared for this exact situation? Lily tilted her head, considering. My father taught me about my rights because he knew that people who look like us don't always get treated fairly. He wanted us to be able to protect ourselves. So yes, I was prepared. And that's exactly why what those officers did was so wrong. Garrett blinked. He'd walked right into it. They were counting on me not knowing, Lily continued, her voice steady. They were counting on my mother being too scared to fight back. They were counting on nobody caring. She looked directly at the three defendants. They were wrong. If you're watching this and thinking about looking away, don't, because this is when everything shifts. Grace took the stand next. Her testimony was quieter than Lily's, but somehow hit harder. She described planting herself in front of the officers, refusing to move, feeling her mother's hands on her shoulders, trying to pull her back to safety, and choosing to stay anyway. Why didn't you move? Moss asked. Because they were wrong, Grace said simply. And sometimes the only thing standing between wrong and right is whether someone is willing to stand. Were you afraid they might hurt you? Yes. But you didn't move. No. Why not? Grace's eyes found her mother's. Because my dad used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the presence of something more important than fear. And my mom was more important. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter pressed a tissue to her eyes. The defense tried to break Grace's composure, suggesting she'd been dramatic, that she'd escalated the situation, that a more cooperative approach would have resolved things peacefully. Grace listened to each question, answered calmly. You're asking me if I should have let them take my mother illegally to make things easier for them, she said finally. The answer is no. I shouldn't have, and I didn't. Garrett shifted tactics. Do you think you know the law better than federal officers? In this case, yes. A ripple of reaction ran through the courtroom. Judge Whitman's gavel came down once. Silence returned. Those three officers broke the law, Grace continued. They knew it. That's why they got angry when we challenged them. That's why they didn't have a warrant. That's why they couldn't give us a reason for the detention. They weren't doing their jobs. They were abusing their power. That's not for you to decide, Garrett said. Actually, Grace replied, it is. Every citizen has the right and responsibility to know when their rights are being violated. My father taught us that, and I'm grateful he did, because otherwise my mother might not be sitting in this courtroom right now. The testimony lasted 3 days. Expert witnesses explained constitutional law. ICE supervisors outlined proper detention procedures. The footage played again and again, each viewing making the officers' actions look worse. Holloway took the stand and tried to claim he'd acted on training and instinct. The prosecution pulled his record, read each complaint, showed the pattern. Chun admitted he'd followed Holloway's lead without question. "I thought he knew what he was doing," he said quietly. Morrison claimed he barely remembered the incident, which the prosecution tore apart by showing his own incident report filed the next day, full of detailed justifications that contradicted the video evidence. Closing arguments came on a Thursday afternoon. The prosecution was brief. The evidence speaks for itself. 3 officers. No warrant. No documentation. No cause. 1 woman targeted for no reason except the color of her skin. And 2 children forced to become lawyers, activists, and protectors because the people sworn to uphold the law decided to break it instead. The defense tried to invoke officer discretion, split-second decisions, the complexity of immigration enforcement. Judge Whitman stopped Garrett mid-sentence. "Counselor, I've watched the footage 17 times. There was nothing split-second about this. These officers followed Mrs. Carter up the stairs. They cornered her. They attempted to detain her without legal basis. And when 2 13-year-old girls challenged them on constitutional grounds, instead of recognizing their error, they escalated. This isn't complexity. It's misconduct." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, every face was set. On the charge of unlawful detention, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations? Guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority? Guilty. All 3 officers. All counts. Mrs. Carter's hand found Lily's. Found Grace's. They held on tight. Judge Whitman sentenced them 2 weeks later. Holloway was terminated immediately, rank stripped, pension reduced. The judge recommended federal civil rights charges. "Your badge was a privilege, Officer Holloway. You treated it like a weapon. You don't deserve to carry it anymore." Chun was demoted, suspended without pay for 6 months, and placed on permanent probation. "You're young enough to learn from this," Whitman said. "I suggest you do." Morrison was terminated and banned from federal law enforcement. "This isn't your first incident. It's your last." The courtroom emptied slowly. People approached Mrs. Carter to shake her hand, to thank her daughters, to say they were proud. Captain Santos found them in the hallway. "I know this doesn't fix what happened," she said, "but I want you to know that because of you, we're implementing new training protocols. Mandatory constitutional law refreshers. Stricter oversight. Your courage is changing policy." Mrs. Carter nodded. "Good. No one else should have to teach their children to stand between them and the law." That night, back in their apartment, the 3 of them sat on the couch. The same couch where they'd collapsed after the incident. The same spot where Mrs. Carter had cried from rage and fear. Now she cried from relief. "You know your father would be so proud," she whispered. "He already is," Grace said. Lily nodded. "We can feel it." And they could. In the way they'd stood firm when others might have backed down. In the way they'd trusted what they'd been taught. In the way they'd refused to let fear win. Jonathan Carter had died 3 years ago. His body failing but his spirit intact until the end. His last words to his daughters were simple. "Remember who you are. Remember what matters. And never let anyone tell you that you don't have the right to stand up for what's right." They remembered. They stood. And they won. 3 months later, Lily and Grace were invited to speak at a youth civil rights forum. They stood on a stage in front of 200 people and told their story. Not for applause. Not for recognition. But because someone in that audience might need to hear it someday. "Knowing your rights isn't about being difficult," Grace said. "It's about being protected. And sometimes," Lily added, "the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and say no." They talked about their father without crying. About the lessons that had saved their mother. About fear and courage and the space between them. When they finished, the room rose in a standing ovation. But the moment that mattered came after, when a young girl approached them, no more than 10, with her mother beside her. "Can you teach me?" the girl asked quietly. "Can you teach me what you know?" Lily and Grace looked at each other, smiled. "Yes," they said together. Because that's how change happens. Not all at once. Not in grand declarations. But in small moments. In knowledge passed from one person to another. In courage witnessed and then practiced. In the decision to stand even when standing is terrifying. The officers who'd tried to take Mrs. Carter were gone now. Their careers ended. Their names remembered only as cautionary tales. But Lily and Grace Carter? Their names meant something different. They meant strength. They meant knowledge. They meant the refusal to be silent in the face of injustice. They meant their father's legacy, alive and growing. And in a world that often tries to teach children to stay small, stay quiet, stay out of the way, two 13-year-old girls had shown something powerful. That sometimes the smallest voices carry the strongest truth. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that courage doesn't wait for permission and justice doesn't happen by accident, then subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders. They're lessons. They're calls to action. And somewhere right now, someone needs to know that standing up is possible. That knowing your rights matters. That two kids and their mother can face down 3 armed officers and win. Not because of luck. Not because of privilege. But because they knew who they were, what they deserved, and they refused to settle for anything less. That's power. That's justice. And that's a story worth sharing.